Russia's own munitions capability is very great. But it's also looking elsewhere, and we've seen that particularly with the use of Iranian drones, for instance.
Since the war in Ukraine, President Putin and Russia have been shunned by the international community, really, and slapped with all sorts of debilitating sanctions. 2 years on, Russia really needs weapons, and North Korea is one of the few countries that will sell to them. Now, for his part, Kim Jong-un is rolling out the red carpet. Pictures have come out of Pyongyang. Roads apparently are lined with Putin's face, and the Russian flags are flying. Jim Townsend is a former Deputy Secretary of Defence for Europe and NATO under Presidents Obama and Biden. Mr. Townsend, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon to you.
Well, it seems pretty clear Russia needs North Korea's weapons. What do North Korea get out of this cooperation with Vladimir Putin and Russia?
Well, North Korea is a pretty isolated place these days, as you know, under sanctions, seen as a pariah. And then having suddenly, over the past couple of years, the Russians pay attention to them, Putin going to North Korea. In the first instance, this is a feeling of respectability that I'm sure the North Koreans are beginning to feel. Although getting respectability by a visit from Putin, you have to question. But there are other things too. I think particularly one of them is help on military modernization for the North Korean forces that the Russians can provide, including space.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'm puzzled by how it is that North Korea have weaponry and ammunition to supply to Russia. Just how good is their technology?
Well, their technology for the basics, like artillery ammunition and that type of thing, is it's kind of moderate. It's what every nation has the ability to do is to make artillery ammunition and that type of thing. The thing about North Korea is that they've got a lot of it because they have forces primed to take over South Korea, and artillery will play a big role. So they have large storehouses of the type of ammunition that the Russians also use. Where they're not very good is in space. They've been trying to launch satellites and they keep blowing up. And so they haven't been able to put up satellites and other ballistic missile types of capability that they want Russian help on.
Presumably, this visit will be incredibly staged managed. There's no way that Vladimir Putin will have any sight of what we still believe to be the appalling suffering of the North Korean people.
That's exactly correct. Everything in North Korea is stage managed, as you've seen in countless photographs and videos of these marching troops. It's quite a choreographed country, and Putin will see all of that, and that will certainly stroke his ego as well. The appalling conditions, hunger and this type of thing, will be kept well out of sight. He will be fed well, he will sleep well, he will see his photo all over the place, and his ego will swell as he returns back to Moscow.
Is he really that much of a thin-skinned narcissist then?
I think so. I'm not an expert on Putin, but certainly his behavior in the past has shown that he is. He's not as bad as Donald Trump, but I think he is. But I think he is certainly has his own mental qualities where his ego being stroked is a good thing for him.
Yeah, I mean, this is a grim old axis forming here, isn't it? North Korea and Russia. And obviously, we're in the midst of our general election campaign in this country with actually very little talk of defence or defence spending. Does it concern you, from your perspective, Jim, that the West of Europe appears somewhat uninterested?
Well, it's a very interesting point, and I have certainly noticed that coming out of the UK. I've spent many, many years working with Europe and in the defense area when I was at the Pentagon, and I would have expected UK to be in the forefront in terms of getting itself, as well as its NATO allied partners and other Europeans too, ready to go just in case we're going to have to deal with a very aggressive Russia. And your point about this axis, it's not just between Russia and North Korea, it's China, it's Iran. So we've got a lot on our plate, and UK has always been the leader and certainly a partner with us. And I don't want to say that UK doesn't lead, but I think the UK certainly is distracted, as you pointed out, the election season upon us. We are too, by the way, with our elections as well. And I think whether it's in the US or UK, we are not as aware, maybe, of what the future could hold for us as they are on continental Europe.
Yeah.
That's the difference.
I mean, you've already illustrated in this conversation you're no fan of former President Trump. Let's say he does get re-elected. What then?
Well, that's the big question. And in Europe right now, on the continent certainly, there's attempts to try to Trump-proof NATO, try to get as many things that the U.S. has been doing by itself, like organizing assistance to Ukraine, getting that put inside of NATO. So no matter what happens with a potential Trump election, that won't go away. That'll be part of NATO. But there's a lot of concern on the continent, and that has led to a push to say, no matter what the situation was politically in the past, right now there's a sense of crisis, and the European nations are really scrambling to try to improve their military capability in case the U.S. disengages somewhat. Certainly, it will disengage from helping Ukraine if Trump were elected, or if there was a contingency in the Indo-Pacific where the U.S. has to send forces that are right now in Europe and has to send them to the Pacific. There'll be gaps that have to be filled, and the European nations, including UK, will have to fill those gaps. And so there's quite a scramble right now on the continent. And I think my colleagues in London are certainly aware of it, but I think the politics, and you know better than I, but I think the politics in the UK are distracted and looking in other directions and not necessarily at a more aggressive Russia.
North Korea. What do these two leaders want from each other?
Well, I think for Putin, it's very much to do with the war in Ukraine, and he has appreciated North Korea's support for Russia's positions from the start of the invasion in 2022. But in particular, although Russia and North Korea deny it, he benefits from weapons supply, artillery, and missiles from North Korea.
Yes.
For North Korea, for Kim Jong-un, I think he's seen a strategic advantage ever since the invasion of Ukraine, and there are all sorts of ways, in a transactional way, that he can benefit. But it fundamentally strengthens his position against the United States as he sees it.
Right. I mean, North Korea, Alistair, have been stacking up weapons, haven't they, for many years now. But what about the quality and the quantity of those munitions when it comes to helping to supply Russia?
Well, I think some of them are being tested for the first time. And some of the reports from the battlefield suggest that not all the munitions have functioned perfectly. But not only does North Korea have a large stockpile of weapons which are compatible with Russian systems, but I think it's very likely that they are manufacturing new weapons that they can supply. In terms of the North Korean's own launches that you see for its ballistic missiles, it's had its failures, but it's had a long run of successful launches. So I wouldn't completely discount the capability of their munitions.
Yeah. Would it? I mean, do you believe the supply of munitions from North Korea to Russia will make a significant difference, or much difference at all, on the battlefield in Ukraine?
Well, initially, the US position, and I'm not on the battlefield and I only have second-hand evidence here, but initially the US position was that it wouldn't make a difference. But now that we're seeing evidence of very, very large-scale shipments of munitions, 11,000 containers is one estimate, that can make a difference. And that I think is now the United States position.
Yeah, I mean, Russia hasn't it, in comparatively recent time, re-geared its economy to the manufacture of weapons and ammunition. It's devoted an enormously larger portion of its national earnings to defense and security. I say defense and security. In the case of Ukraine, we're talking about attack.
Yeah, and of course, that's absolutely right. And Russia's own munitions capability is very great. But it's also looking elsewhere, and we've seen that particularly with the use of Iranian drones, for instance.
Now, what about North Korea? What does Kim Jong-un want to get from Russia. I mean, this visit has been discussed in terms of aid from the Russian side, munitions from the North Korean side. But tell us a bit more about what North Korea, the country you know so well, what do they hope to gain from this?
Well, it's taken quite a long time for this visit to come about. When Kim met Putin in 2019, he invited him, and then invited him again when he saw him in 2023. So it's 5 years, if you like, since it's materialized. In strategic terms, I think that Kim Jong-un sees Russian support as ensuring that he will not face in the United Nations or elsewhere effective sanctions against his nuclear program. And he'll also enjoy Russian support on issues like human rights as well. In terms of the benefits, he probably wishes to increase economic relations and diversify from China, on which North Korea has become extremely dependent. But he will be looking for all he can get, and I don't know how much he will get, in terms of technology transfers, incoming tourism, which will be a source of income, and exchanges in a range of areas which may provide money for his coffers.
And what about just basic subsistence supplies? I mean, are the people of North Korea well enough fed? I mean, we're all familiar with the famous satellite pictures. You look down at North Korea from a satellite and you see darkness across North Korea. You see bright lights in South Korea. We know the economy there and the agricultural economy is so much more backward. Are people of North Korea in need of basic supplies, food?
There is a humanitarian need, and the United Nations has attempted to quantify that. When I was there, which was up until 2018, there was no obvious starvation. People had a frugal diet with inadequate protein, and there was still some stunting of children and so on. But actually, the country was fed. Since then, with the COVID lockdown that North Korea imposed on itself, and the blocking off by themselves of all external trade for a period, it's very likely that conditions deteriorated and that levels of subsistence went down, and there may have been localized loss of life. I'm not there, I can't see it, but that's very likely. So yes, they do need more food. It's a mountainous country. It's difficult for North Korea to grow enough food for its people of a diverse kind. So it's reliant on external trade. And when it stops the external trade, there isn't enough food.
Really, really interesting to get your analysis, Alistair. Thank you. Alistair Morgan, the former British ambassador to North Korea.
This is Kate Borsey. It's the evening edition here on Times Radio. Vladimir Putin then will begin a 2-day visit to North Korea tomorrow. That's according to the Kremlin. It's the Russian president's first trip to the country in more than 2 decades. It's the latest sign of a deepening alignment that's raised widespread international concern. Let's speak to Dr. Janny Matzov, senior lecturer in international politics at Aberystwyth University and an expert on Russian politics and security. Good evening, Jenny.
Good evening.
Give us the significance of this visit. He's not been to North Korea, Vladimir Putin, for quite some time, but that's because it is pretty much a closed-off country. Why is he being allowed in?
Oh, he's being welcomed in with open arms. So you may recall that back in September, the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-il, went to Moscow. Went to the far east of Russia, and was welcomed very effusively by Putin. Visited various military technical facilities, and generally sort of had a good time, and invited Putin to come back and visit him in North Korea. And this is Putin saying, yes, I'm going to do that return visit. So it's significant, I think, for 2 reasons. Firstly, the immediate reason is clearly Putin is shopping for weapons and ammunition to use in the war in Ukraine. And North Korea is rumored to be a significant source of those weapons, even though both Russia and North Korea deny it. It's strongly suspected that the North Koreans are supplying them with weapons, but also as a symbolic way of saying to the West, in particular, I flout your petty restrictions. I'm going to make common cause with North Korea, and you're not going to stop me.
Gosh, goodness. So there's some shopping going on there potentially, and it's all about the symbolism as well. two leaders who perceive themselves to be incredibly powerful, and we shouldn't, mock that at all. They each have their own power, and together they are more powerful, of course. It's quite rare, isn't it, for Vladimir Putin to make state visits?
It is. I mean, he's been to China recently, but apart from that, he tends to stay at home quite a lot, especially since COVID. But also now, of course, the International Criminal Court has got a warrant out for his arrest, so he has to be careful where he actually travels to make himself not vulnerable to being picked up and put into handcuffs. So yeah, it is quite rare for Putin to make a major visit like this. So it has a particular symbolic sort of resonance and significance that he's gracing the North Koreans with his presence.
And what's the significance of him going to Vietnam after this trip?
Well, this is a good question, because one of the things that we've seen since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine is Russia has been redoubling its efforts to reach out to countries, particularly in the global south, those who are not necessarily lining up behind the West to support Ukraine, to try and demonstrate that it can play a leading role in the world, to try and offer an alternative to the US-led hegemonic world system. And so, reaching out to specific countries, trying to strike trade deals, which is almost certainly what he's going to be doing in Vietnam, and just generally trying to improve relations is another way of, again, symbolically, diplomatically saying, we are not, actually, Russia is not a pariah. We laugh at your restrictions. We can actually travel, we can do things, we can strike deals. We are in touch with the majority of the world.
Look, thank you so much for being with us. Really interesting stuff. Dr. Janny Matzov, Senior Lecturer in International Politics at Aberystwyth University. Thanks for being with us, Jenny. Much appreciated.
The world doesn't stop while the UK has its general election, of course. Vladimir Putin is in North Korea today. It's the Russian president's first visit to Pyongyang since 2000, and he arrived to a literal red carpet. Richard Lloyd-Parry is Asia editor for The Times. Morning to you, Richard.
Hello there, Stig.
What's he doing this for? First time in 24 years. Why would he do this?
Well, his relationship with Kim Jong-un and with North Korea has become more and more important since the invasion of Ukraine. Vladimir Putin doesn't have all that many friends left in the world. He certainly lost a lot. And last September, Kim Jong-un went to Russia. He met Putin at a cosmodrome in Siberia, where they hung out and had talks. And at the time, it seemed slightly pathetic even that Putin was reduced to turning to the North Koreans for friendship. But now, a few months later, people are taking it a lot more seriously. For one thing, North Korean manufactured shells have turned up in sort of smoking fragments in cities in Ukraine. So we know that Kim really is sending munitions which are being fired into Ukraine, day by day. So that's, looking more and more important for Putin as he fights this increasingly protracted war in Ukraine. But also, people are beginning to wonder now that they're just having their talks now, but the article that Putin wrote in the North Korean media and briefings by his aides has talked about deepening the friendship and even forming some kind of treaty. So the question is, where will it end? And also what Kim Jong-un will get from the Russians in return from his shells and missiles. There's a lot of nervous speculation that it might go a bit beyond the help we think he's been getting with his satellite launching rockets, that he may ask Putin for example, help in mounting ballistic missiles in submarines. If he could do that, if Kim Jong-un could fire his nuclear warheads from a submarine, that would really be a big change in the strategic balance and a big headache for South Korea and the United States and all their allies.
And where's China in all of this? Because China do support North Korea, don't they? So did they want this to happen? Is this an axis that goes through North Korea, Russia, China, North Korea together? What's their public stance on it?
Yeah, I mean, there are big changes and shifts taking place in East Asia, which are becoming more obvious month by month and year by year. And it feels more and more like a return to a kind of Cold War arrangement where two blocks are forming up. On the one side, you have the US and its allies, its NATO allies, and also Asian allies, South Korea, Japan, Australia. On the other, you have coalescing this other bloc. It's no longer a kind of communist bloc because Russia's not communist and China isn't really. But it includes China, Russia, North Korea, maybe Iran. They are coming closer together. They're helping one another out. I don't think China will mind that Russia and North Korea are getting close. There was a time when China and Russia competed in a way for North Korean friendship. The North Korean rulers before Kim Jong-un used to play them off against one another rather skillfully. But they're more and more now uniting around a common agenda, which is opposition to the US and its allies. And there's a lot of lengthy commentary in the North Korean media today about opposing what they call a unipolar world, which means a world dominated by the United States, and building a multipolar world, which means a world in which you have more than one superpower. And this is the kind of theory that is behind all this.
What's striking about that list, though, Richard, is only one of those countries is actually a superpower or even a power, really. China is obviously a hugely powerful and increasingly powerful economic state, but North Korea is a failed state. Iran is a theocracy which has had sanctions for years and years. It's kind of a failed state. Russia is a small economy considering its size. Taken together, do they become more threatening than their parts? Is that the argument, I suppose?
They're very threatening because they have nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Iran maybe, the other three definitely. I'm not sure it's right to call North Korea a failed state.
Really?
We thought it was going to be a failed state in the 1990s. Everyone had written it off. But it has survived. It's not a very nice place to live and to be a North Korean, but the state is still very strong. No one imagined that someone like Kim Jong-un could have survived for this long. And they are, a nuclear-armed axis. That in itself gives them power and importance. And in some ways, the economics is secondary.
And we also have, with Putin, he has cordial relations with India. He's going to visit Vietnam next. You can broaden this out, couldn't you, to a whole bunch of countries that aren't as opposed to Russia as people might think who don't consider it very much.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to the kind of Cold War theme. There aren't many countries in the world, governments of the world, I think, that believe that the invasion of Ukraine was a brilliant idea. I think that includes China and India. But that's not the same as coming out and opposing it. I mean, what you find when you talk to a lot of people from the kind of smaller and middling countries is that they're desperate not to be forced to have to choose a side, which of course is what happened during the first Cold War in the second half of the 20th century. There were two teams and you had to pick a team. And people were rewarded because they picked a team, not because they were, laudable governments or democracies. I mean, there were all kinds of horrible pro-US, pro-Western Cold War dictatorships, which you remember. And, that's the thing that's happening now. So, I mean, India doesn't necessarily, I think, support what Putin's doing or what he stands for, but they don't want to be put in a position where they have to pick a side because they see advantages, strategic advantages, self-interest in keeping the two sides balanced against one another so they can pick and choose their alliances and allegiances.
And then you throw in China's influence in other parts of the world like Africa, and all of a sudden there's a coalition of sorts that is very significant, isn't it?
It's hugely significant. It's a great big turning point, really, in the way the world is set up. You can feel the gears grinding, beneath all this, beneath the sort of, in some ways, rather superficially comic theatrics of the bear hugs of Kim Jong and Putin at the airport.
I think that's such a good point. It's easy because there is something intrinsically funny about Kim Jong-un and Putin. You can underestimate them probably quite easily. Richard, really interesting stuff. Thank you for joining us. That's Richard Lloyd-Parry, the Asia editor for The Times. There's always been something essentially funny about dictators as well as scary. But there's something of the ridiculous, but you can't ignore the threat beneath it.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has landed in North Korea and is expected to meet with the country's dictator Kim Jong-un in a sign of the two countries' deepening alignment. The streets of the capital, Pyongyang, were lined with Russian flags and posters of Putin ahead of his arrival. his first to the country since 2000. This week's visit is a rare overseas trip for Putin since he launched the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and a key moment for Kim, who has not hosted another world leader since the COVID-19 pandemic. Victor Cha is former Director for Asian Affairs at the White House National Security Council. He's Senior Vice President for Asia and Korean Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. Good evening to you, Victor.
Hello, how are you?
Very well. Really pleased you were able to join us this evening. What do you think of the significance of the talks that are due to take place between these two leaders?
Well, I think they're pretty significant. As you said, this is probably Putin's closest ally in the war in Ukraine, in the sense that North Korea was one of the first to recognize Russian gains in eastern Ukraine. They've gone against every UN resolution condemning Putin. And of course, now they're supplying critical ammunition to Putin so that he can continue this war.
President Putin, I mean, there aren't that many countries he can actually go to because of the legal proceedings against him from the International Court. What do you think he'll be looking for from North Korea?
Well, I think he's looking for more ammunition. Again, even if Russia is producing at full capacity for the war they want to prosecute in Ukraine, they still will have a shortage of ammunition. So they do need that from North Korea for the foreseeable future, ballistic missiles as well. And the big question is, in return, what Putin is willing to give North Korea besides food and fuel in order to get that ammunition. He needs it he cannot win the war in Ukraine without this ammunition. So for the first time in the history of the relationship between these two countries, the North Koreans have the upper hand.
Yeah, it's fascinating this. The Kremlin is describing the trip as a friendly state visit. And we're hearing there's going to be a big parade in the central square, a concert, and so on, with North Korea essentially rolling out the red carpet for the Russian leader.
Yeah, I think this is, for the North Korean leader, this is the last time we saw him on the international stage is when he had that huge failed summit with Donald Trump in Hanoi in 2019. And then after that, he went into a 3.5-year COVID lockdown. So this was about the best thing that could happen for the North Korean leader to be able to do their version of a state visit, giving all the bells and whistles to Putin. So this is very important for North Korea in terms of recovering from the embarrassment of the Trump summit diplomacy for their domestic audience.
How much do we think that North Korea is really able to provide the Russians with when it comes to the military hardware that Putin wants for the war in Ukraine?
So according to experts that we work with, Russia produces about 250,000 rounds of ammunition a month at full capacity. Yet the war they're prosecuting in Ukraine requires 10,000 rounds a day. So they have clearly a net deficit monthly. And there's only one country they can get that from, and that is North Korea. It's also been the case that the Ukrainians have reported North Korean ballistic missile parts in Ukraine after the attacks by the Russians. So North Korea is providing ballistic missiles, and they're also able to test the accuracy of their ballistic missiles by watching them work on the battlefield in Europe.
Because we've heard suggestions that actually the equipment and the ammunition which North Korea can provide is pretty ancient stuff, somewhat out of date. But in a sense, if you're looking at ballistic missiles, maybe that doesn't matter.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. And their ballistic missiles are actually not as bad as some of their old ammunition, the initial ammunition they gave to the Russians. They're actually pretty good ballistic missiles because they've sold them to Iran and Pakistan and others. In terms of the ammunition, the thing to worry about is North Korea has given away all its old stocks to Russia or sold them to Russia. Now they can produce new and better ones, which have an impact not only for Russian stockpiles in the war in Ukraine, but also for the military balance on the Korean Peninsula and in East Asia more broadly.
President Putin has taken several of his senior ministers with him. How do you think this sort of visit plays back at home?
For the Russians, I mean, I think, again, as you mentioned, they're completely diplomatically isolated now. And I think from Putin's perspective and his people, this is a very strategic move from their perspective because they are not only using the North Korea relationship to affect the battlefield in Europe, by what Putin potentially can give to North Korea, they're affecting the military balance on the Korean Peninsula. They're affecting broadly the security in the Indo-Pacific, and they're also affecting North Korea's ability to threaten the continental United States with intercontinental ballistic missiles.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen the United States very concerned about this meeting, haven't we?
Yes, I mean, I wish the U.S. had expressed more concern earlier from the very first report of sale of munitions to the Wagner Group when they were involved in the war. But it's become much more apparent lately, I think, just because the volume is so large. We're talking now about, they've reported over 5 million rounds of ammunition, over 10,000 shipping containers going from North Korea to Russia that are filling 3 munition stockpiles right on the war front.
And those could, presumably really strengthen Russia's hands at a time that there are real concerns about Russian gains, especially along that eastern front in Ukraine.
Yes, I think that's right. The Russians really do need this ammunition, as I mentioned earlier, and it was coming steadily at a time when U.S. support for Ukraine faltered. I mean, eventually the supplemental package was passed, but it will take some time for that aid to get there. And in the meantime, the Ukrainians are suffering under all of this artillery and ballistic missile fire, some of which is coming from North Korea. So, we're seeing something we have not seen before in history, which is North Korean weapons being used in the battlefield that are killing Europeans.
And two of the remaining dictators, the remaining powerful dictators in that part of the world, essentially joining forces and defying Western sanctions.
That's right. They're defying Western sanctions, and Russia has made no secret of its desire to dismantle the entire UN Security Council regime of sanctions, which consists of 11 UN Security Council resolutions, all of which Russia previously had signed up to. Russia is not only defying them themselves, but it wants to try to dismantle those 11 Security Council resolution sanctions as a part of the favor to North Korea for this new military partnership.
Victor Cha, former Director for Asian Affairs at the White House National Security Council, now Senior Vice President for Asia and Korea at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Really good to speak to you this evening. Thank you so much for joining us.
The Russian president to North Korea, where he's been meeting Kim Jong-un, sharing their innermost thoughts, apparently, at a summit in Pyongyang. I'm joined now by Dr. Janny Matzov, who's a senior lecturer in international politics at Aberystwyth University, an expert on Russia. Hi, Jenny.
Hi, how are you?
I'm very good. What have we learned from their sharing of their innermost thoughts?
Well, one major achievement of this visit is the signing of a mutual defense pact, and I think this is really the thing to focus on because under this pact, from what we understand, Russia and North Korea will, regard each other as allies, but also be willing to come to each other's defense in the case of aggression against one or the other. And depending on how loosely this is interpreted, this really opens the door potentially for, certainly in the short term, for North Korea to not only provide more ammunition than it already has, but potentially even to provide troops to fight in the war in Ukraine. And Russia to provide all kinds of assistance to North Korea, which could sort of support their economy and make them a stronger and more stable country. So I think it is quite significant for all of the hyperbole and the high flown language. I think there's some very concrete, practical things which have come out of this visit.
They've signed a mutual defence treaty, as they're calling it. Kim Jong-un saying he fully supports Russia's invasion of Ukraine. What will North Korea want in return for that sort of rhetorical and military support?
So what North Korea wants is what it can't easily provide for itself. So agricultural products, food, but also technology. There's a mention of sort of medical technology and support of various kinds. So the more of the nuts and bolts of everyday life that the North Korean economy really just has not been able to supply its people with. If North Korea can get these kinds of things from Russia, then it will create a much more comfortable life for its people, but also potentially a more politically stable life for the North Korean leader.
Thanks very much for that. That's Dr. Janny Matzov, a senior lecturer in international politics at Aberystwyth University.
Now, the sun has just set in North Korea, but it is still party time in Pyongyang after President Putin's first visit to North Korea in 24 years. Well, is that your kind of party? It's the sound of the main square in Pyongyang, where North Korea's Kim Jong-un pulled out all of the stops to greet one of his few allies. Vladimir Putin received a rapturous red carpet welcome with crowds waving balloons, flags and roses as a marching band played and ceremonial gunfire rang out. I'm sure you can picture it. North Korea's Kim Jong-un called Putin the dearest friend of the Korean people, said he fully supports Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And then the two leaders signed a pact of economic and military cooperation, which Kim called thoroughly peaceful and defensive. Well, a little earlier, I spoke to John Nielsen-Wright, who's head of the Japan and Korea's programme at the Centre for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge. Can you put into context the significance of this meetup?
It's very significant. I mean, it's obviously a much closer relationship than has existed in the past. It's not unexpected. President Putin, of course, met President Kim Jong-un last autumn in the Far East, and there have been efforts by the Russians to cement the bilateral relationship. We had a visit in March by the Russian head of intelligence, and of course, as has been well telegraphed, even though North Korea doesn't admit to this, it has been providing considerable amounts of arms, artillery shells, missiles to assist Russia in its conflict in Ukraine. And of course, from Korea's point of view, from North Korea's point of view, this closer relationship is beneficial for a lot of reasons. It has helped to weaken and undermine the international sanctions regime, which is an attempt, of course, to prevent North Korea from developing its nuclear weapons capability. We saw Russia veto in the Security Council not so long ago continuation of the so-called panel of experts set up internationally to keep an eye on North Korea's nuclear proliferation and development plans. That's a further material enhancement, if you like, of North Korea's strategic ambitions. And there has been a real appetite on the part of the North Koreans to secure active security support from Russia to help develop its cutting-edge technology, particularly in the satellite space area. It's yet to be determined whether, in fact, the Russians are willing to give that support. But one thing we see coming out of this visit is a clear commitment to work much more closely together as security, economic, trade and financial partners. And that's obviously a worry to the United States and its allies.
And can you also put into context just how much all of that or any of that changes the world order? And I mean, I hate to be selfish about it, but I'm going to do the UK thing, changes our own security, if at all, in this country.
Well, I think for Britain it really does matter. I mean, we are an Indo-Pacific power. We've made that very clear through the Integrated Review and last year the publication of the so-called Integrated Review Refresh. East Asia remains a very important part of the world for us economically. Our bilateral partnership with South Korea, underscored by the recent Downing Street Declaration. Last year, of course, we had a summit, we had a state visit by President Yoon, the South Korean president. For us, it really matters that for one of our very important liberal democratic allies, they remain safe and secure. And North Korea's cooperation with Russia is making that harder for us. And of course, for us in Europe, any efforts by North Korea to support Russia in maintaining its aggression in Ukraine is clearly not in our interest. So this matters in both geographical theatres, and it matters also because we've seen so much progress by North Korea in developing its security capabilities.
So the agreement, which guarantees mutual help in the event of aggression, the fact that that is a public agreement, the message is being sent out, you and I are talking about it today, Is that so very different to what has happened before, or it's in the publicity of it that we hold a difference?
I think it's the latter. I mean, as a declaratory statement, this is designed to say from Moscow and Pyongyang's perspective that efforts by the United States to shore up its alliance partnerships with its traditional partners, Tokyo and Seoul, will be met by a similar initiative. But if you look at the substance, what does that mean? If there were an attack on Russia or on North Korea, then the two countries have pledged to work together. But that's still fairly ambiguous in terms of what it actually means in substance. And hopefully it'll never come to that. I mean, there's the response on the part of the US and its allies is defensive rather than offensive. And for Russia, of course, there's not only the relationship with North Korea to consider, there's the relationship with South Korea. There are important trading ties. Russia is concerned that South Korea not go further in its support for Ukraine. South Korea has yet to provide, if you like, lethal support to support Ukraine in its war against Russia. And this has been a bit of a red line for the South Koreans. If Russia were to provide unambiguous material help to North Korea that could allow it to undermine the security of South Korea, we might see a very different sort of relationship and a greater appetite on the part of the South Koreans to do something more substantive when it comes to supporting Ukraine. So both countries are, in a sense, aware that they need to be careful about not crossing one another's red lines. And that's why I think this has been couched in fairly ambiguous terms. It's not a material change, but it does signal, I think, greater political and diplomatic coordination by these two authoritarian regimes.
There is some concern here, John, that perhaps defence and our place on the world stage is not playing a big enough part in our domestic politics and in the general election campaign. I wonder whether you would agree with that. I mean, are we obsessing about capital gains tax whilst Armageddon looms?
No, I don't think that's fair, actually. And I think if you look at the effort that Keir Starmer and the Labour Party has placed on inoculating themselves from the criticism that Labour has been weak on defence, I think you do see a serious continued engagement. The discussion about the share of our defence expenditure, that it should be at 2.5% of GDP. Both of the main parties have signalled their support for that idea. I think it's a reminder that we live in a very perilous and uncertain world, getting more so by the minute. And I think you will see, if the polls are believed and Labour is returned in a couple of weeks' time, a new government that will need to take a pretty robust position on maintaining our security interests. The question is the British public prepared to support those initiatives, particularly when it involves extensive commitments, quite some distance geographically from the UK itself.
It's all very interesting stuff, isn't it? John Nielsen-Wright, who's head of the Japan and Korea's programme at the Centre for Geopolitics, which is at the University of Cambridge.
Now, I want to talk about North Korea and Russia, where they have strengthened that relationship with a military pact, promising a fortress of mutual aid. Kim Jong-un says he fully supports the war in Ukraine. He's promised to boost munitions for Russia. And Vladimir Putin is calling for a review of UN sanctions against North Korea. So Dr. Edward Howell, the North Korea foreign policy specialist, is with me and is on the line. Hello to you, Dr. Howell.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me on. It's very good to be here.
You're very welcome. Can you just give me an appraisal then of Vladimir Putin's visit and what it really adds up to now?
So Putin's visit wasn't unanticipated. He agreed to do this after Kim Jong-un was invited to Russia last September in 2023. And at this visit, they had several hours of talks. This is the current visit, which went from yesterday to today. The two leaders had several hours of talks. Putin was welcomed along a red carpet, the streets of Pyongyang festooned with images and portraits of Putin and Russian flags. And we saw sort of two quite significant moments. The first was Kim Jong-un firmly supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This was expected. And the second was that the two countries signed a deal, an agreement in terms of mutual assistance in the event of aggression. Now, this clause is not specified. We don't know the full details of this treaty that has been signed, the agreement. We don't know under what conditions this mutual defence treaty might be enacted, we don't know actually whether Russia or North Korea would enact this clause. But what it is interesting for me is that this signals some similarities with a 1961 agreement that the Soviet Union signed with North Korea that did pledge mutual assistance and had an automatic intervention clause in the event of any attack.
So, look, how valuable is this relationship to Russia beyond having a supplier of munitions for the war in Ukraine? Is that enough? Is that just an end in itself?
So I think that this relationship, the foundations of this relationship are transactional. They started in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Russia gets a supply of a lot, millions of rounds of artillery in exchange for giving North Korea cash, food, and military and technological assistance. Okay, now that's a necessity for Russia. I think that moving forward, though, this relationship is valuable insofar as it highlights the idea of a united front, an anti-US, anti-Western coalition of illiberal countries coming together. And the message that Russia and North Korea are trying to say is that the US and the West cannot isolate either of these countries because if they do so, they will fail.
And does that then materially affect any calculation when it comes to NATO's confrontation with Vladimir Putin in Europe on the eastern flank of NATO?
What's important here is that this meeting highlights that actually Russia's war in Ukraine is not just a Western Europe, NATO problem, it's East Asia's problem as well. And I say this because when the NATO summit takes place next month in Washington, South Korea and Japan and the United States will be there. And I think the three countries really need to put on a concerted, coordinated effort to oppose what's going on between Russia and North Korea. Because even if the war in Ukraine ends tomorrow and Russia doesn't need North Korean artillery, I don't think that this relationship would just end immediately. Trade, military trade proliferation is likely to continue.
Yeah.
And that's very, very worrying.
Right. And what about China thinks of all of this, Edward? I mean, they have a North Korea there on the frontier, which is a mercurial power at the best of time. How will they be viewing all of this?
It's a really important point to mention because China and Russia do have a mutual defense treaty. It's one of the only mutual defense treaties that either country has with another state. And China, I think, is going to be playing it very cautious. China obviously has strong economic relations with North Korea. It's North Korea's largest economic partner. China also has strong relations with Russia, as evidenced by recent meetings between Xi Jinping and Putin. But crucially, I think China will not be actually very happy with what we've seen today. I think China would not want the relationship between Russia and North Korea to get too close because China will be losing out. China matters far more to North Korea than Russia does. China wants a slice of the pie. And I think historically this is really important because China was a signatory to the Korean War Armistice Agreement.
Yes. Tell me a bit more about why China may not be entirely happy, because they do have a certain amount of leverage over North Korea, certainly when it comes to economic support and that sort of thing. So maybe North Korea having another friend in the shape of Russia weakens that leverage. Is that part of the problem?
That's one issue, but there's another issue, which is that actually China is one of the largest trading partners of South Korea. Okay. Now, Russia and South Korea have strong economic relations as well, but I think China will want to make sure that nothing happens that completely alienates South Korea.
Yes.
Because, if North Korea and Russia continue to develop strong ties, well, the South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol, is going to be faced with a real dilemma. He was asked only a couple of months ago or even earlier than that, what he would do if, Putin went to North Korea. And he said the South would have to review their relations with Russia on a case-by-case basis. Clearly, he hasn't been able to provide lethal aid to Ukraine because he doesn't want to. Okay. And I wonder whether today will be a sort of a clear red line when we see the full details of this mutual defense pact, comprehensive strategic partnership, whatever we want to call it, of South Korea taking a more active role in supporting Ukraine.
All right, so it's like an interesting game of three-dimensional chess. Dr. Edward Howell, good to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un have vowed to aid each other if the other's country is attacked. The mutual defence clause is part of a comprehensive strategic partnership which the pair signed in a bid to unite against the United States. The Russian leader, who's visiting North Korea for the first time in 20 years, claimed the agreement is defensive and peaceful in nature. The Kremlin chief was treated to a lavish ceremony when he arrived in the North Korean capital, Pyongyang. Well, Dr. Sue Mi Terry is a senior fellow for the Korea Chair at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies and a former senior analyst on Korean issues at the CIA. Good evening to you, Dr. Terry.
Thank you for having me on.
Just tell us what you make of the significance of this security pact signed by these two leaders.
Well, first of all, the actual text of the document is yet to be released. So the details are uncertain. Maybe they intentionally left it uncertain, so we can all talk about it. But it does include a mutual defense provision calling for each country to provide military assistance should the other be attacked. And so this is a very significant development. We've been seeing burgeoning military alliance or relationship between Russia and North Korea ever since Russia invaded Ukraine. We know that North Korea has been assisting Russia in its war efforts. North Korea have sent some 10,000 containers that are filled with munitions and artillery shells and ballistic missiles to help Russia. The question is, what is Putin going to provide North Korea, right? North Koreans want food and fuel, but what else? Is Putin now going to provide sensitive military technologies that's going to aid and accelerate North Korea's WMD program? We know that North Korea has been focused on that. They've been expanding, diversifying, modernizing their missile program ever since the Hanoi summit with between Kim Jong-un and Trump collapsed. So that's the key question. How far this relationship is going to go and how, what kind of sensitive technology that Putin is going to ultimately provide North Korea.
You talked there about the scale of the munitions which North Korea has already been providing for the Russians. I mean, there were some suggestions that perhaps the military hardware which they're sending is a bit out of date. It's not particularly modern. It's not what the Russians need. But do you think it is making a difference to the Russian military campaign in Ukraine, where Russia does seem to have been gaining ground?
Well, it is war of attrition, and they're every single day they're fighting, right? And the Russians are supposedly going through some 20,000 shells, these artillery shells. So yes, it is true that North Korea stuff is not it's not the most sophisticated. That is all true. But it is still making a difference because they got a lot of it and they are sending a lot of it. And then another concern is North Koreans also get to test these weapons in the battlefield. They didn't really get to do that before. So on top of the fact that it's actually helping Russia in Ukraine, it's also helping North Korea because they're able to also test their own weapons. So this is just all around, not a good scenario for United States and its allies and the world.
Yes.
But then,
I was just going to
ahead.
ask you a bit more about that because the United States is clearly concerned, and presumably that is in part because of the concerns about what President Putin might be giving to North Korea, adding to the instability in that part of the world.
That's absolutely right. So that is a key question. And I don't think we will know right now. They made it intentionally vague. Putin did talk about increasing military cooperation, but he was not specific in terms of what sensitive technology that Russians are going to provide North Korea. And there are a whole list of things that Russians can provide North Koreans with to help their WMD capability. So that is a very important question, and I don't think we have an answer yet. But if you recall, in September of last year, Kim Jong-un and Putin met when Kim Jong-un went to Vladivostok and met with Putin. And 2 months later, North Korea was able to successfully launch a satellite when North Koreans failed to do so 2 launches prior to that in the same year. So there is concern that there is some sort of cooperation, guidance and advice and cooperations that Russians are giving North Korea. But now the key question is, more than that, what sensitive technology Russians will provide North Korea?
I'm looking at the gifts that were exchanged, and apparently Putin gave his host a limousine, a kind of dagger, and a tea set. And Kim reciprocated with works of art depicting Putin. That's last bit is according to the Russian news agency. What do you make of the actual personal chemistry between these two leaders who are both in their own ways leading such isolated lives?
Well, they do have certain things in common. They're both dictators. They're both leading pariah states that's isolated from the world. But you know, I can't speak to the bromance between Putin and Kim, and I don't know if they have the kind of chemistry that Kim Jong-un and President Trump had, for example. You know, you recall famously former President Trump saying, you know, they are in love with each other and they have exchanged love letters and so on. So I can't speak to the chemistry between Putin and Kim Jong-un, but clearly Kim Jong-un went all out for this summit, preparing for the summit, because this does help him. This kind of symmetry helps him. It doesn't make him look like a global leader hosting a world leader and look like a normal country to his own people. So it does give him a little bit of kind of legitimacy that he's looking for. In terms of gifts, I would just say that Mercedes is violation of UN sanctions that Putin himself signed on to. So yeah, obviously he's violating, you know, the international sanctions regime, but I'm sure he's not concerned about that.
But clearly what is of concern in the West is the way that these two leaders are managing to get so much of, in particular, the military equipment and technology that they want and need, despite all those sanctions, and the fact that they are able to, if you like, define their own side in this new world realignment.
Yes, I think this actually means Putin is no longer have any illusion about joining the West, that he's bent on creating a different kind of bloc and going against sort of the US-led international order and the way we're operating. So this is a very, very concerning development.
Dr. Sue Mi Terry, former senior analyst on Korean issues at the CIA, and now a senior fellow for the Korea chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. It's been great to speak to you. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.